Hello and welcome back. In this video we are going to be painting this beautiful beast. But before we do that, we need to address this. This is the canopy. It sits on top of the fuselage. It is basically what protects the cockpit from the outside elements whilst the aircraft is in flight. Now, this is really one of the more delicate situations in scale modeling process of building and painting it, because these are supposed to be really nice and clean. The moment you put cement in contact with this piece of acrylic plastic, it will go really bad. That's why there are dedicated glues to attaching canopies. One of the more common and easiest methods of attaching the canopy is by using PVA glue or wood glue, which sets clear. It's not a permanent bond, but it's good enough. However, assuming that you don't have that at home, we'll be using this, and we'll be using this in a very steady hand. So we'll put the canopy inside like it's supposed to go. It's supposed to snap in place anyway, like so. And then what you have to do is, and this is really, I'm stressing, you have to be really careful, because if the contact cement gets into contact with the clear parts, it's gonna go murky. So the idea here is to use the flowing capabilities of this cement, and it will flow in just the right crevice. So once you set the canopy down and you're happy with the position, you take your cement and just tap it on the edge, just go very close to the edge. It will flow nicely, like this, nothing more. Turn it around and do the same thing here. And you can see the cement flowing. Press it down from the top to make sure that it's a nice seal, and then do the same thing on the back side. Just tap it ever gently, just on the edge. Push it down a little bit, make sure that it has a firm contact. And the last unnerving step is in the front. Just a little bit. Press it down. That's it. That is it. You've successfully attached the canopy. Now it's time for painting. Here's a small hack: how to putty if you don't have putty. So up here we have a little bit of a mess on the fuselage, and I have to take care of the hole. If you don't have putty, what you need to do is take a little bit of sprue from your model and scrape off some burrs, just like this. Nice long burrs. And what you do is you take your glue, put it on your fuselage, and take tweezers and take one of these spurs and plastic and just place it on top and secure them right down. As you might have guessed, the glue is going to melt the plastic and thus curing it to the body. Once it's cured, you take your favorite file and file it down to the desired depth. These are the paints that we're going to be using here today. These are acrylic paints from AK Interactive, and they closely match the paints that Revell is providing in their instruction manual. So let's quickly recap what we're going to do. We're going to be painting this and this camouflage pattern. Revell has their own line of paints. Some of them are marked as RLM colors, which are historically accurate colors. But if you don't have exactly specifically these ones, as long as they are matching to this, it's going to be fine. So the trick to painting a model is, first of all, preparation. The first step, of course, as we all know, is clean the surface that you're going to be painting. But even more important so is in the future, where this hobby becomes more mainstream in your life, you're going to want to prepare the surface by using a surface primer. The surface primer does two things. First of all, it prepares the plastic to accept paint better. And second of all, it shows and highlights all the imperfections in the plastic, because during the build process, like here on the nose, here you see I have sanded down the seam lines and fixed up the gap using just cement and some regular plastic from the sprue that I scraped off. This might seem flush and smooth to the touch, but when you put paint on it, the paint will show you every single imperfection. But because this is a beginner tutorial video, we're not going to be using primer. We're just going to be building and painting the model. However, that doesn't mean that you cannot do anything to make the paint stick better. Here I have a piece of very fine 1000 grit sandpaper. It's really fine. You can go even finer, like with 150 or 2000. And what you do is, the surface that you're going to be painting, just scuff it up a little bit. Just lightly scrape the surface. Don't go overboard with this step. Just make sure that lightly scrape it. You'll see some scuff marks on the surface, and that is because you want to allow the paint to stick to the model as best as possible. But be wary, don't scrape the canopy. If you're going to scrape the canopy, then you're going to lose the shininess, the brightness. It's going to become mottled, and you don't want to do that. So just go around the model just slightly, just so that it bites into the plastic, but not so much that you lose critical detail. And since we're going to be painting both sides, I'm going to do this for the whole model so that I don't have to do this later. That's it. In the next step, this is one that we all know, is we take some alcohol and we just clean the surface, because now we've left some dirt and debris on top of the surface while we were sanding it slightly, and we want to remove that. Okay, with all this out of the way, it's actually time to start painting. How to paint? We are going to be taking advantage of what is called layering effect, which means that we're going to be layering one paint on top of the other. Layering means just like it sounds. You put one layer on top of the other, building it up gradually. And it also means that you take the lightest paints and put them on the bottom, and the darkest paints and put them on top. This is what I mean. In this case, we have paints that I've ranged from lightest to darkest. Now, it is much easier to layer paints on lighter surfaces than on darker surfaces. So if you take a look at the aircraft and the way it's supposed to be painted, you see that the majority of the body is painted with this blue paint, especially here on the bottom. So what we're going to do is paint this blue layer first. And after this dries, we will paint yellow nose. After that dries, we're gonna proceed with the wing surfaces that are gonna be painting in this dark green. And after that is dry, we're gonna be painting with this gray-green paint, which might be counterintuitive to say that this is lighter than this is darker. But in this case, this is darker than this. And this is an example. In this case, these are some dots that I've put on a piece of paper. This green is far lighter than this gray-green paint. So this is the order we're going to be painting it. Now we just take our little paint tray. We'll take a little paint tray, mix this paint real good, put a couple of drops in, and as needed, you should dilute it. But in my case, this one is pretty good. It's ready to go from the bottle. That's why I'm just gonna proceed to painting the model with it. Now, of course, start with the bottom, which is, you know, the easiest, because here, even if you make a mistake, nobody's gonna see it that much. So you just paint. And again, the idea with painting is you paint in one direction first. Again, be mindful of how you hold the brush. The more thin down the paint is and the more layers you're gonna intend to put on, the less likely it is that you're gonna see brush strokes. And the finer brush that you have, the better off you're gonna be. So the thing is to paint only in one direction for one layer, and then proceed to paint in the other direction with a new layer. And it doesn't matter if you go inside the wheel wells here when you're painting, because the paint inside is much darker than the outside paint, so you know, you can quickly cover it up if you make a mistake. But you can quickly see where I'm going with this. You quickly apply paints in layers, thin layers, quick layers, it's gonna be fine. Alright, so this is finished. Now I'll be using a hairdryer to quickly dry out the paint and then proceed to put another layer of paint on the model. To avoid brush strokes in general, thin down the paint and then go in different directions each time you apply a layer of paint. So now we're going to go in this diagonal pattern. This way we're going to be covering the bottom layer of the paint that we've just painted previously, and we're going to be covering this one in diagonal. This way we're going to make this kind of crisscross pattern, and we'll slowly be building up layers of paint which will cover the model and of course mitigate the amount of brush strokes visible on the model. Second layer done, we'll blow dry it and then do another layer. And we're coming back to third layer. This time we're gonna go in different directions, so I'll have to be mindful where I put my fingers. We're gonna go in this direction, so this diagonal direction. So we will cover the bottom layer again, making sure that we crisscross as much as possible. And don't put too much paint on the brush. Just light it up, just put a little bit on. If you put too much paint on the brush, then you have to really work it in. Okay, so let's dry this up again. Okay. It's been drying. Now I have to do a fourth pass, and this time the paint here inside the tray has thickened up a little bit because of course it's drying in air. So what I have to do is put a little drop of water inside to reactivate it. I'm just putting a little drop of water inside, making it reactivated and refreshed. Again, we'll take the excess off and we'll just proceed to paint again. And this time we're gonna go in this direction. I'll dry it off and come back. Alright, I've dried out the paint. It looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the results so far, but I think that I should do another pass just to make sure that I cover everything up real good. And I'll go from front to back now. I'll do this in this direction, so I'll load up the paint in the brush and just go like this. And try not to get too much paint into the details. Here, maybe you can see it. There's a little hole here that it's supposed to be not filled with paint, so just be mindful of that. And on the surface of the, oh shoot, it doesn't matter. And on the surface of the aircraft, there's a little bit of a detail here. Maybe you can see it on camera. It's right here. There's a little hatch. It's really shallow detail, so the more diluted the paint, the less likelihood it's going to be that you're going to cover this thing up. So that's my top tip for you. Don't go heavy on the paint. All right, so I'll dry this up. Come back. So now the paint is totally dry and it covered really nicely. I'm really happy with the result. But as you can see here, I've painted on the canopy. I've touched with, I wasn't careful and I put a little paint on the canopy. And the good thing about acrylic paints and shiny, smooth surfaces is that the paint comes off really easily by just scratching it off, and you're not gonna damage the bottom surface. So I have here my toothpick, and I'll just go and scratch it off real good. See, it comes off real easy. Can tidy up the windows, and we don't have to mask them off. Masking is another very painful procedure in scale model building, and we will touch upon that when we'll be spray painting it. But for hand painting, masking is not that problematic. So I have nicely covered all the model, and you can see, we can still see the ribs of the aircraft. They're still showing through, and there's still detail here. You can see it under the light that is still shining through or seen through, but we didn't cover it up too much. And that is, I think, the most that you can get out of hand painting with this 5 layers of paint. We've done a little bit of a mess here where we've taken too much paint and it spilled inside, but we can clean this up by using this paint and going over it, and there we'll have to be really careful not to spill it out again. But that's the only real problematic area. Now you can see here when I was talking about the imperfections in the bodywork. As you can see here, there's not a very good seal between the air intake and the wing, and that's where you see this little gap appearing, and the paint exposes this, right? Every imperfection. So what you would do in this situation when you're using a primer, you would use putty or maybe even use cement to force the part down more. But because we're not using this, we can kind of do this. We take a lot of paint and just kind of try to blob it in, right? Just like this. We'll let the paint seal the imperfection and use a little toothpick to force the paint inside. And as you can see right away, the paint did seal this little gap here to some extent. It's not a solution to end all and be all, but you can get away with something like this. The one other thing that we do have to paint before we actually go on is the back horizontal stabilizer. On the bottom, it needs to be the same paint as here. And because we are just going to be using one for this demonstration purposes, we're going to be putting it into a little bit of a clamp. This is a really handy tool to have. It's basically a crocodile mount on a stick for barbecues. It's really inexpensive. You can just clamp it on, glue it in place, and you have a little holder. Now we have to paint it. Okay, that's done. We also need to paint one of the landing gears. We'll have to paint, of course, I think. So we'll paint the landing gear as well. We'll put it in our little clamp and just paint the covers. And it's done. Easy peasy. So now we are done with this blue paint and we have to move on to the yellow, German yellow.